can thank that Martin Luther.
All right, welcome to confirmation. Cell phones should be up in the buckets. If you're small group leaders, want your question sheet, they've got those up here by the buckets for each grade level as well, if you want to be looking that over for that. Great, thank you. There'll be plenty of time to talk in our small group sessions. Remember, just get your sermon notes in. Does everyone have a Bible? It's been a few weeks here now. We've been handing out Bibles. All right, brought yours with. If you never got one, see me afterwards, so make sure you get one. Just one notice about small groups. We meet all over the church. Unfortunately, there are some groups who have been meeting in the nursery and ended up trashing the nursery after it's been all cleaned and ready to go. So that now is off limits. So if you can't be nice, we can't use nice things. All right. So don't meet in the nursery. If you need a space to meet, groups can meet in this room as well as others. So remember, wherever you're meeting, leave it at least as good as it was when you got there. Let's have a word of prayer as we get started. Lord God, we thank you for tonight, for a chance for us to continue to grow in our relationship with you and each other. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So Sunday, we celebrate a special day. What day is that? That's not Halloween. Halloween is one day we celebrate on Sunday. There's another day which is called the Reformation. Reformation Sunday is also on October 31st. Now, most of us associate the 31st with Halloween, as you said. Where do we get the name Halloween? Anyone know the origin of that? Why we call it Halloween? All Hallows Eve. The word hallowed is like we use it in the Lord's Prayer, hallowed be thy name. The word hallowed simply means holy. So we're saying, holy be your name. And so we use this word holy as we refer to saints. And so typically in our nowadays we call it All Saints Eve. But that it gets shortened and turned into All Hallows Eve, which becomes Halloween, which is not what we're going to be talking about tonight. So anyway, but get that out of the way. Halloween is also celebrated 31st, but we're talking about what happened 500 years ago about this time. This is what a map of America looked like in about 1715, all right? That's after some of the early Spanish, Portuguese explorers had come. That's what today we would call Florida. That's basically all they sort of knew of this world. So try to put your mind in that mindset, all right? 500 years ago, 1517, 1520, end of the Middle Ages, but all kinds of new ideas were coming. The Renaissance was coming in, and people were starting to think in some new ways. And there were all kinds of change happening, protest movements going on against corruption, the abuse of power, whether it was secular or religious, all kinds of new ways of thinking about how do we live in relationship. We didn't really have like the modern countries we have today. Those were still all in the process of being formed. So in the midst of all this, there's this guy we call Martin Luther, right? He was a Catholic monk, also a university professor. And he said, we need to talk about what's going on. Things are they're not the way they're supposed to. Particularly, his issue was with the church. So one of the things that the church was doing, they offered something that looked like this. It's called an indulgence. It meant the theory was that some people were better than they had to be, so they had extra credit. And instead of wasting the extra credit, you could sell it to other people so they could use it. So if someone wasn't good enough to get into heaven, they could buy the extra credit someone else had left over and then use that to get into heaven. But instead of giving it away, the church was selling it to people. And Luther says, I don't think that's how it's supposed to work. I don't see anything like that in the Bible about how we're saved. And so he says God's grace is free. We don't have to somehow buy our way into heaven. Now, sometimes there's confusion when I'm talking about Martin Luther, so I want to make sure you guys know who we are talking about, all right? There's Martin Luther and there's Martin Luther King Jr., all right? Martin Luther, the guy on the left, is who we're talking about. 500 years ago, Martin Luther King, back in the 60s, 50s and 60s, was a civil rights leader in this country. But sometimes he'll get confused because the names sound familiar. So what do you know about Martin Luther, the guy from on the left? Anyone know anything else about Martin Luther? All right, a little video just to remind us of some facts.
One day, when Luther is 21 years old, he experiences something which will affect him for the rest of his life. Suddenly, a thunderstorm erupts, a wild, violent one. Luther is terrified of being struck by lightning and dying, because all his life he has been told that he must earn a place in heaven when he dies, and he doesn't think he has done that quite yet. So he falls to his knees to pray, not to God, but to Saint Anna, so that she might ask God to look after him. And Luther promised that if God would see him safely through the thunderstorm, he would offer the rest of his life to God by becoming a monk. Luther cannot understand it if God's intention is really for poor people to spend all their money buying their way out of punishment so they can go to heaven. And why should it be easier for the rich to avoid a long time in purgatory than it is for the poor? He thinks it's way too much about money and too little about God when priests sell letters of indulgence with slogans such as, "When the coin in the coffer clings, the soul from purgatory springs." Luther wants to discuss this with other monks and priests, so he writes 95 theses and nails them to the church door in Wittenberg where he lives. The church door, you see, acts as a form of bulletin board and is a completely normal way to put things up for debate. Luther is allowed to defend himself at a trial in the city of Worms. The church hopes that Luther will withdraw what he said and wrote, so that everything can return to normal. But Luther will not. He maintains that if no one can prove him wrong through arguments or quotes from the Bible, he must be right. I cannot, and I will not regret what I have said. I cannot act against my conscience, Luther says. Not many in the audience have heard the word conscience before, but they are in no doubt as to whether Luther stands firm on his beliefs or not. As a result, they declare him an outlaw. This means that anyone now has a duty to catch him and hand him over to the authorities. After Luther has been outlawed, he is forced to hide. He hides in his friend Elector Frederick's castle, Wartburg. Up until then, the Bible has only existed in Greek and Latin. While hiding at Wartburg, Luther translates the entire New Testament into German. Luther wants people to have the opportunity to read the Bible in their own language, so they do not depend on the priests and the church's interpretation. Because Luther sees the Bible as God speaking to all people.
All right, so that's part of the story, and we'll talk more about that on Sunday as we celebrate Reformation Sunday. So it was a protest movement. We call them Protestants, people that followed sort of this movement that Luther started. And there's lots of things that people protest different ways, and we'll maybe talk about that in your small group time, or things that get reformed. Laws that we have that after time we realize this law has been unjust, that it needs to be changing. The way that we had laws in this country about that ignored racial equality, that we had different laws for black people or white people. As time went on, we said this needs reformation, a reform, and we had the civil rights movement. There's been ongoing kinds of movements to bring reforms where things get out of whack. 40 years ago, women couldn't be pastors in the Lutheran Church. Now they can. 10 years ago, we said that people in a same-sex relationship can be pastors. Now over the years, this whole idea of indulgences, Catholic Church, it didn't take long, about 20 years after Luther, the Roman Catholics said, this really was a bad idea. We shouldn't have done that in the first place. They were recognized as well. But there's other things where there's still some differences between Protestants and Roman Catholics, and we'll talk more about that at another time. We talk about a Lutheran is as a noun or an adjective, right? Follower of Martin Luther, member of a Lutheran church, you could say is a Lutheran. Some people, their primary identity, they say, I'm a Christian. Other people say, I'm a Lutheran. Others, there are certain kinds of Lutherans. There's different ways we use this word. But somehow it means you're characterized by the theology of Martin Luther. So there's lots of churches in Africa where the language and the style looks very different from our worship that we have here. But they're very Lutheran in terms of following the theology, the way of thinking about God that Luther did. So even though the style is very different, we have this idea of being Lutheran. Now, in this country, there's three basic kinds of Lutherans, right? Where you see the green, that's sort of what we call the ELCA. That's the church that Joy is part of, our Lutheran church. And so those are counties where you see where the predominant church is ELCA. The blue is a church called the Missouri Synod, which is a little bit more conservative. They don't allow women to be pastors. And so in many ways, there's a more conservative we are. The red spots are something called the Wisconsin Synod. That's like the church right on the corner there over by Churchill is a Wisconsin Synod church. So there's a few of those around the country, and they're sort of very, very conservative. And so there's sort of a range of people even within the Lutheran family that'll range from very conservative to more progressive. But all of them would call themselves Lutherans and would point to the theology of Luther as a way of guiding how they see themselves. Likewise around the world. This is where you're going to find most of the Lutherans. See, Germany up there is probably the most, where there's the most Lutherans. Second most Lutherans is going to be in Indonesia. And then you sort of go to Africa before you find, they have more Lutherans there than like in our country. And the church is growing the most rapidly in Southeast Asia and in Africa, much faster than it is in Europe or the United States. But again, the churches there will look very different, but they have the same basic theology. So what is that? What does that Lutherans believe that makes someone a Lutheran, whether you're in Tanzania or Malaysia or the United States? The core belief is that we are saved by grace, right? That's sort of the number one thing. We're not saved by anything that we do, not by our actions. We're saved by something that God does for us. And that sort of becomes the defining thing. But most Lutherans, I still struggle with that because we still think we have to do something. The other thing that they talk about quickly, way to think about that, there's things in our life that we earn, things that we're given, some things we get just because we're lucky, right? So if you're really good at sports, that might be because you've earned it. You worked hard. You've practiced hard. So that goes in that column. If you have blue eyes, you did nothing to get your blue eyes, all right? That was a gift from the genetics in your family. Sometimes you just get lucky with something. But we're saying faith is not something we've done by earning, not something we get by luck. It becomes to us as a gift. All right, we talked about the authority of Scripture. That's one of the core Lutheran things, is that's why Luther spent all this time trying to translate the Bible into a language. And when he was put on trial, he said, I will recant everything I've written, just show me in the Bible where I'm wrong. And they were not able to do that, so he says, here I stand. I can't do otherwise. So we say the Scriptures becomes the bottom line for us. Helps us to understand what is it that God wants us to do. You guys know what a paradox is? Something that seems things that shouldn't be possible, two different kinds of things. And for Luther, that was one of the core beliefs that he had, is that we are at the same time saints and sinners. It's not like there's some people who are good, who are the saints, and there's other people who are the sinners, who are the bad people. He says all of us are both at the same time. I love this little icon here. It's because it says saint and sinner at the same time, right? You read it this way, and it says saint. Flip it over, and it says sinner. Same time, we are sinners, we are saint. Saint, sinner, saint. We're both of them at the same time. So that's one of the key Lutheran teachings to understand who we are. And then he would talk about that we are the church, all of us. It's not like there's a hierarchy that pastors are up here and regular people are down here. He says, no, there's no hierarchy in this. We are all, he talked about the priesthood of all believers. We all stand before God on equal footing. And we all have callings. There's not, calling to be a pastor is not a better calling than calling to work on an assembly line, or to be a carpenter, or to be a teacher, or a nurse, or whatever it is that you have the gifts to be able to do. The verse that really turned Luther around and got him going on the track he was a passage from Romans that said that the righteous live by faith. And that's, we talked about faith is a relationship that we live in. Once he figured out that we're not saved by our righteous actions, but by our faith, everything fell into place for him. So we'll be talking more about that throughout the year. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on that since we're coming up celebration of Reformation on Sunday. Let's go back to our overview of the Bible story, right? We've been focusing on the book of Genesis, sort of the characters, the events that happened during that time. And I gave you sort of an aerobic way to remember that. If you remember our overview of the story, it was creation. God created everything. It was good. Do it with me. Everyone hands up. Hands up. All right. So creation, the whole earth, created good. Then we say sin entered the world, and we had the fall. All right. God says, I'll get rid of sin by the flood. The water comes up, doesn't get rid of sin. So God says, I have to find another way to do this. It's going to be a covenant. So like that. So sort of handshake. So the creation, the fall, the flood, the covenant. That takes us into the stories of creation. Adam and Eve is the story of the fall. Noah is the story of the flood. Abraham is where the covenant starts, and he passes it on from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. All right, so we left off last week with Joseph and his family moving down to Egypt, and things are going well down there. They have a home. They prospered. They lived there about 400 years. But this one family now has grown into hundreds of thousands of people, and things would have been great if Pharaoh had lived forever. But Pharaoh died, and a new Pharaoh came who didn't like all these immigrants living there and decided to make them slaves and to use them for building the cities. And so the next sign in our sort of aerobic Bible study is going to be captivity. They were made slaves, so why don't you take your hands, go like this. So you are captive, all right? You're bound. Captivity. And so this is their reality then for hundreds of years until they cry out to God, do something. So God does something. He raises up someone to come and rescue them, a deliverer, a guy named Moses. All right? Now again, Moses is an unlikely leader. Maybe you remember this miraculous birth story where he was born, and they, at that time, Herod was killing all of the male children, drowning them in the Nile River. And so to save them, his mother makes a little boat, puts him in the boat, little ark, kind of little woven basket, puts him down in the water. Pharaoh's daughter finds him, thinks it's an abandoned child, and raises him as one of Pharaoh's children. All right, and uses his mother as a nurse, doesn't realize who Moses' mother is, and takes his mother as a nursemaid to help raise him. So he grows up in Pharaoh's court as an Egyptian, and he sees the Egyptians mistreating the slaves, and he ends up murdering one of the taskmasters and has to run away because he'd be killed for committing murder. So he runs away, hides out as a shepherd. God calls him out of his hiding there, counters him with this burning bush thing, and reveals his name. He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right? That goes back 400 years. I'm the same God who talked to your great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. But he says, well, but what's your name? And so God says, just call me I am, all right? Which means I always, the past, present, future, I am just God throughout it all. It says, I am. And so that's the name that they use. And so Moses goes to Pharaoh, and he says, God says, let all his people go out in the wilderness. And Pharaoh says, no. And so we have all these plagues and miracles and signs and wonders in order to try to convince Pharaoh to let the people go. So the last of the plagues was the angel of death was going to be sent to all over the land to kill all the firstborn children of every family. How many of you guys are firstborn children? Right? Too bad for you. All right, so you would have been dead. All right, I'm a firstborn too. But he says, for the Hebrew children, I'm going to give you a way out of this. The thing was, all right, angel of death is coming, and somebody has to die. All right, if it's not the firstborn child, it has to be someone else. And so what they do, they would take a lamb, right, and they would kill the lamb. The lamb, something has to die, so the lamb dies. And to show that the lamb died, they take the blood and they painted it on the door. And then when the angel of death came to each household, if there was blood on the door, they'd say they would pass over that house and go on. Now it seems really creepy, an awful thing to do. Angel of death coming around, killing everybody, all the firstborn children. An awful thing. Think of all the Egyptian families. They hadn't done anything wrong. It was Pharaoh. And it seems to me just an awful thing. But it's through this the slaughter of all these innocents that finally Pharaoh says, okay, that's it. Take your people, get out of here. And so that night they pack up, they come out, God leads them, they pass through the waters of the Red Sea, and they make their way into freedom. So if this is the sign for captivity, then the sign for the Exodus or the freedom is simply to break the chains, all right? So it's a captive and freedom, okay? Captive, freedom. So let's start from the very beginning. We say, everyone up, say creation, the fall, the flood, the covenant, captivity, freedom. So this is basically the story of Exodus, all right? They were slaves in Egypt for most of that time, but at the end of it, and the story of Exodus is the story of Moses being born and leading the people out of the Exodus. That becomes that, you see the break in the timeline up there. This is the defining moment. So if they were we measure our time BC and AD, all right? They measure their time from starting before the Passover, before the Exodus and after the Exodus. That is the defining moment for them. And so that's where they start counting time. That is that critical of a thing to say this defines who we are as a people. So Exodus, Moses becomes this most important. So Abraham was critical. The covenant started with him. Moses is the one then who really forms them into a nation, right? And the way they do that is to head out into the wilderness. And this becomes really this time of training for them. They spend 40 years there. It doesn't take 40 years to walk from Egypt to Palestine. You can do that in a couple of weeks, all right? But they spend 40 years because they needed 40 years. They needed a couple generations to forget the old way of life and to start a new way of life where they would learn to trust not just in doing whatever your master told you to do, but to learn how to listen to God, how to follow God's laws or rules. Now, they had very few resources out there, so God provides for them. In the morning, he would provide manna. In the evening, he would provide quail, something for them so they would be nourished, but they would depend on God for their life. And when they had been slaves, they didn't have to worry about what to do. They just got up and did whatever your master told you to do. But now that they were free people, how would they make a decision? How do I live with my neighbor? What do I do? What don't I do? And so Moses says, well, here's the laws. This is how it works. This is how we live in a relationship with God. And these are rules of how we live with our neighbors. And at other times we'll talk about these 10 commandments. And there's hundreds of laws that Moses ends up giving them, I think 613 different ways that guide our lives and how we are to live. Now, it just wasn't a list of things not to do. They were positive things to say, this is how we respect property. Here's how we respect members of our family. Here's how we respect God. And gives sort of a structure, a shape to this newfound freedom. Sort of like when we were forming our country, we needed a constitution, something to say, these are the parameters. Here's how we know how we are to live or not to live. And this will guide our lives together. So that's what Moses really lays out for the people. Now, at that time, there was rules for everything. Just like when you guys were smaller, there were a lot more rules in your lives, right? Your parents said, you cannot touch the stove ever, all right, when you were little. Now they say, cook breakfast for yourself, all right? You're old enough to take care of yourself. Learn some responsibilities. And so when we were little, we had lots and lots of laws. And as we get older, sometimes we still have rules, but they change a little bit. So part of the rule as you get older and older is you get more responsibilities and more freedoms. And so that's part of the dance that happens between now and adulthood. We learn how to figure that whole thing out. Well, that's what this 40 years in wilderness was for them to figure out how to go from being children to becoming adults, how to learn how to make good decisions for themselves as opposed to having someone tell them what they should do. Later on, when Jesus comes, he'll take a look at all these rules and he says, this is really more complicated than it needs to be. When you were little, you needed all these rules. He says, we really don't need all these rules. He says, I can sum it up in two things. He says, love the Lord your God with your heart, soul, and mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. He says, if you do those two simple things, you fulfill all 613 of all these other laws. That's what they were all being boiled down to, is loving God with your whole being, loving your neighbor as yourself. All right, so during this time they learn that they are people of God, that God has claimed them and made a promise. Remember the promise made to Abraham way back when was that the whole world would be blessed through them. Now, here they are 500 years later. They've grown into a large number. They're heading towards a promised land, but it's still not clear how the whole world is going to be blessed through them. But it's during this time that religion really emerges. Until this time, there really wasn't much of a religion. There were just people, they were waiting to hear from God, or they would make a sacrifice of something, but it wasn't in a structure, organized way. Moses really gives them a structure. He says, we need to build a tent that we worship in. We need to have an altar. They created this thing called the Ark of the Covenant, all right? And in that they would keep these 10 commandments. He would keep some of the manna to remind them that God was the one who would take care of them. And Moses then prescribed, how do we worship? What do we do? How do we do offerings? What kind of festivals do we have to help us remember the story of God's love for us? And there were things like a scapegoat, where the idea was, we would take the sins of people and you could put it on to someone else, like the scapegoat, and then you drive the scapegoat out, or you would sacrifice a goat or a lamb to be able to carry away the sins of the people. So all these laws are developed, and again, the ark becomes really the central point, this box that they had that reminded them, wherever this box was, they said that signified for them the presence of God. And we'll see that shows up all the way through the story. That becomes the center place. It'd be sort of like our altar. Say, what is it that the center of our worship space would be the Ark of the Covenant. All right, so these first 5 books of the Bible, you've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. See on the bottom there. Sometimes we call those the books of Moses. Genesis told us the story about Abraham and his descendants from creation up through the covenant. Exodus really tells us about this time of deliverance from being slaves in Egypt. The books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy really talks about the time they spend in the wilderness, where God reminds them of all the rules the laws, the way that they structure their life together. And so that becomes really the first 5 books of the Bible. We call that the Pentateuch, right? 5, penta, like Pentagon, 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And for some Jewish people, they say that's the whole of their scripture, just those 5 books. They would say that's all that we need. We don't need any of the other stuff. That tells us everything that we need to know. But obviously there's more than this. Now we're going to, in our small group time, we're going to take a look at a Bible verse that comes from the book of Deuteronomy. It's the 5th of the books of Moses there. And Moses is doing a review. He says, we've spent 40 years in the wilderness. We're going to get ready to go into the promised land. So let's review what have we learned? Have we spent 40 years? Have we learned anything in that time? And it says, you're going to make a choice. It says, when you leave here, I'm not going to be there. I'm not going in with you. I'm not going to be there to hold your hand. I'm not going to be there to tell you what to do. You need to figure out for yourself, are you going to take this path or that path? Are you going to follow the light or the dark, that which leads to life or that which leads to death? And he says, I can't make you do the right thing. I can only invite you to do the right thing. So he says, consider now how you're going to live. It's sort of like when you guys get old enough to leave home, you're going to make some choices, right? That mom and dad won't be telling you there to get up or to do this or eat that. You're going to make choices for yourself. Who I'm going to hang out with, what am I going to do with my time, what am I going to do with my money. So what they're doing now is training you to try to make wise decisions when that time comes. But the time comes, like Moses let the people go, he says, for good or whatever, you're going to make those decisions for yourself. And that really starts the next part of the biblical story. But let's pause and review again where we've been. We started with creation, the fall, the flood, the covenant, captivity, and freedom. So now they're free. They're out they've come up all the way to the promised land. And they've got this promise that God said, I shall be your God, you should be my people. And so they enter into this land. And so when they left Egypt, they did so. When they left Egypt, they did so by parting the waters, right? So they could walk through. On the other end of the wilderness, the same thing, the way to get into the promised land, God parted waters again. This time it was a Jordan River. So the bookends on either side of this wilderness time is passing through the waters. And we talk about that, even when we talk about baptism, we use water as that sign of the beginning of our journey when we're baptized. We make the sign of the cross. And the last thing I do when we're putting someone into the ground is to make the sign of the cross for them, to remind them that they were baptized. That's the other end of the journey. So God has taken this bunch of slaves and trained them, taught them, and now they enter into this promised land. And so the sign for this is there's going to be lots of fighting going on. So the sign for this, I call it the conquest. All right, and so it's a fight. So you put your arm like this, so like you're going to fight somebody. All right, so conquest. So captivity, freedom, conquest. Now this is my least favorite part of the Bible. If someone was asking me, what do you hate most about the Bible? I'd say it's these books of Joshua, Judges, Joshua and Judges. They tell the story of this time of the conquest, where they come into this land. And obviously there's these books here of Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. They talk about this time where there's people living there already. And they come in, they say, I'm sorry you're living here. This is going to be our land now. And you can leave or we will kill you. That was the choice. All right? They didn't say, let's try to live in peace and be good neighbors. They said, either you can leave or we will kill you. And so it's stories of genocide and all kinds of fighting. I mean, just killing women, children, animals. And this is all because they said God wants us to. It drives me crazy. I just hate this part of the Bible. I say, how could the God that I know ask people to do what he asked people to do? In many ways, it's sort of like what happened in this country. White people came in, Native Americans were living here. we could say, wait, you've got great land. We want that land. You can leave and go on a reservation, or we will kill you. And the same thing happened in Africa. In South Africa, when the Afrikaners came in, this story has been repeated again and again and again. Someone comes in, they see something they want, and they take it, and the result is terrorism, right? Now, the books talk about people fighting back because the people who were living there didn't want to leave. They'd been living there for centuries. And so we have this terrible fighting going on, stories of assassination and terrorism and all this weird kind of stuff that I don't know exactly what to do with, but it's part of the story. As much as I would like to ignore this, pretend it didn't happen, I just can't. I mean, it's right there. It's in black and white. You can read it right before you. And these people, they make them into heroes and lift them up. I remember hearing all these great stories about Samson and Gideon and things like that. They're great, courageous leaders, but they were conducting genocide, right? So it's a dark period of time, but somehow they get through that time, all right? And they're living there, and they have this loose confederation. It's not a country yet. They have these 12 tribes, and they divide the land up into tribes. And whenever they needed a leader, God would raise up someone like Samson or Gideon or whatever to help them fight some enemies. And then when the battle was done, they'd go back to life as normal again and do that. But the whole idea, most of the laws they had that Moses was giving them was to keep yourself separate, right? Today we call it apartheid, right? We say you live separate from everyone else. You don't go to the same restrooms, you don't use the same drinking fountain, you don't go to the same restaurants. Everything is different. They're separate. There's you and there's everyone else in the world. And so they had all these rules. You couldn't grow two different crops in the same field. You couldn't have two different types of fabric in your clothing. Everything was about staying pure, staying separate. There's no commingling, all right? You weren't supposed to intermarry with anyone else. And part of the reason, even for farming, they said, these people were wanderers in the wilderness. What did they know about farming? They would talk to a local farmer there. The local farmer says, now the first thing you do before you plant your seeds is you make a sacrifice to the fertility goddess. And they would say, no, that's why you have to keep yourself separate from that. And that's really how it started. Now, as time goes on, especially when we start getting to the New Testament, we get the story of Jesus. Jesus says that was a particular time and place where maybe that needed to happen. But he says that is certainly not the reality now. God's love is not just for one people, not just for one kind of people. It's for the whole world. This blessing was not that you alone would be blessed, but that through you, the whole world will be blessed. But we have to get through this dark period of time before we start finding this blessing being for those around them. Now, this time there's no secular government, right? It's certainly not a democracy. It was the closest thing we would talk about it today. It's about like Sharia law, right? Everything was religious law, is all that they had. And they would, and that's what governed everything that they had. When time came, God would raise up a leader to help them when they did that. But people complained. He says, we don't want to live this way. All the rest of the countries around us have kings, all right? And the kings then make the decision. They don't have some God telling them what to do. They have a king who makes those decisions. And they says, we want to be like other nations. And God says to the leaders, people like Samuel, he says, tell the people they don't know what they're asking for. If you get a king, he's going to tax you to death, and then he's going to take your daughters, he's going to take your sons, and he's going to do whatever he wants. That's what kings do. But the people said, no, we don't care. We still want a king. And so at the end of this period, during this time of Joshua, Judges, I got another slide of that. The end of Samuel then is going to start this the time is sort of where it goes into the gold there, the era of the kings. And God says, if you think you want a king, I'll give you a king. You can see how that turns out for you. And then that becomes this, instead of being these 12 loosely tribes, they come together under one kingdom. And we're going to be hearing about those kings sort of in the next section. So let's do the aerobics again. Creation, fall, flood, covenant, captivity, freedom, conquest, right? The fighting that goes on with that.